Well, hello. In case anybody actually ever watches this and they haven't been watching some of my other videos, which means they're not our close friends or family, my name's Cameron Youngstrom. I live in West Virginia, and I thought I would make a different video here today. Probably more for personal cathartic reasons than anything. But some of my musings, some of my learnings, and maybe a little bit of a background on me to start off with. But yesterday was the 4-month anniversary of me getting laid off from the company that I worked for over 23 years. And I thought that after 4 months, it would probably be a good idea to look backwards, think about how I got here, what's going through my mind at this point, things that my wife and I have talked about, where we think we're going to be going in the future, and kind of document this and see where it goes. Whether it ever sees the light of day, I have no idea. In case you're wondering, I'm sitting on the porch overlooking the eastern side, the valley, down into the Potomac River area, from our cabin / maple syrup farm. So I've been up here for about a week, which is why I look pretty raggedy. I don't even own a hairbrush up here. I need a haircut pretty bad. But I thought I'd make this video as I was thinking about some things in between putting up rafters on the 100 or so year old barn that I'm putting up, which are in other videos if you're interested in that sort of thing. So just background on who we are. Again, my name's Cameron Youngstrom. I'm 52 years old. I grew up in a variety of different places, mostly Wisconsin and California. My wife is also from California. We both, interestingly enough, found each other in college. I think we were the two poorest people in college, as we both came from pretty meager backgrounds. We were both the first people in our families to go to college. I ended up going to graduate school, ended up getting a PhD in chemistry, did that in Texas. We were already married at that point, so my wife followed me. She started down a road becoming a teacher, didn't care for that when she started substitute teaching, which will be ironic here in a minute to some people. But she's worked in a couple different things, but mostly since we've moved to West Virginia and I started my chemical industry job, she's worked for a periodontist for most of those same 23 years. Took a couple years off to have the kids. We have 2 kids. They're both in high school. Our son is a senior. My daughter is a freshman, and that will have an impact on what I'm about to say in a couple minutes as well. As I mentioned, we've lived here for 23 years. In West Virginia, our home is in a city called Parkersburg. We live in the historic district, which is an amazing place. And then this is our farm, which is about 3 hours away up in the mountains by a congressional wilderness area called Dolly Sods. And we have come up here because we love the area for rock climbing, backpacking, that sort of thing. And in the last handful of years, I've now become completely addicted to making maple syrup. So if you happen to have picked up a bottle of maple syrup for sale at the end of a driveway on your way up Dolly Sods, that would be from our farm. We've called it Icarus Farms because we are so close to the sun. We're actually the highest maple syrup sugar camp in the state, and probably should have called it Dolly Sods Maple, but at the time that sounded pretty good. So, with that being said, I came to work in West Virginia, and I often get asked, how did I come here? It's because this is where the company that hired me out of graduate school was. And when I looked at the different locations that they had, it was General Electric Plastics. This seemed like the best place on the map. I did not want to live in Louisiana. I didn't want to live in Indiana. New York has never really resonated with me. I'd never been to West Virginia, but it looked like it was a good place, even though it has kind of a bad rap in the media, which is undeserved, I would say. This is actually an amazing place. It's basically like living in a park with very few people in it, as you can see behind me. The downside is the economy is not, stellar. But I had a good job in the chemical kind of valley that runs along the Ohio River, and thought that we would come here, get my feet on the ground, and then figure out where we went from there. 23 years later, I'm still here. I have, in the course of those 23 years, had to do a number of things to be able to stay here. I changed my career trajectory within the company multiple times, which kind of sounds negative, I guess, just on a whole. But what that did is it allowed me to not have to relocate, but it also inadvertently, and much to my surprise, allowed me to expand my horizons and do a lot of different things that I never expected to do. I figured I'd be a lab rat. What I've ended up doing for the last 14 years, math isn't doing so well now, is I moved out of R&D and actually was doing more strategic growth innovation work, which was kind of walking the fence between R&D and business development, trying to figure out new things that our company could do using its resources, whether that's people, expertise, pots and pans, that sort of thing, and getting into new growth markets that we had never played in before, and preferentially big growth markets where we could either open an entire new area or bring something to the market that was very revolutionary. So that was 23 years. In May, actually, it started in April, but it concluded in May 9th. I was actually laid off along with about half of the company, as my company has essentially decided to exit the Western world. GE sold us to a Saudi Arabian company in 2007. So I've actually worked for that company much longer than I worked for GE. A lot of the culture was retained, but also a lot of it came out of Saudi Arabia. And that brought some benefits as well as some interesting challenges, particularly on risk aversion. And for me, working in innovation is a high risk area. And so we essentially had a big target on our back. And so, in retrospect, none of this has been that big of a shock. Actually, if I go back to the beginning, the first day I ever worked at GE, I got on site and I was walking around to try to get to know the area, get to know some of the people, see what's going on. I ran into Beth in our pilot plant. I don't know if she'll ever see this or not, but she basically jumped me and said, "What the heck are you doing here? This place is going to be closed in 6 months and you're going to be out of a job." I happened to show up to work the day after they had laid off a bunch of people. So it obviously wasn't a good time on the site. The layoffs were in manufacturing and I was in R&D. So it was a completely different part of the company, but nevertheless, the feelings were there. That sentiment has existed the entire 23 years, 23 and a half years that I worked at that company, in its various forms. There was always an axe hanging over my head. I can't even remember how many reorganizations I went through. We were sold. We completely changed directions multiple times, and I'm talking 180 degrees. One day we would come into work and we would be told we had to develop $100 million businesses. The next day I would come in and we were told we're not going to do anything that's less than 12 months out. The layoffs and the reorgs were astonishing. I would, if I had to guess, since we were purchased by the Saudi Arabian company in 2007, I think we probably averaged one, maybe one and a half reorgs a year. At some point, we had, I think, three or four in a single year. So, needless to say, it was a difficult environment to work in, especially if you're doing longer term, innovative R&D type related activities. Those are generally the first things that get targeted in layoffs, and it becomes a bit of a bloodbath. What actually ended my career at that company was even worse. As I mentioned, they essentially have decided to exit the Western world. From what I've heard, it's somewhere between 40 and 50% of all of us got let go. They kept the bare minimum amount of people to keep manufacturing run, and a couple R&D folks just to deal with big calamities that came up. And then a handful of the sales force. Everybody else is gone, and everything is up for sale at fire sale prices piecemeal. So I don't think that company is going to exist in any recognizable form probably in a year or two. This kind of hit the head at Christmas time last year. It became pretty obvious that we were not looking good, even though my part of the company was the only part that was actually making money. We started to have some pretty big leadership turnover, people that questioned the longevity of decisions were fired essentially on the spot. The edicts that were coming down were sheerly insane. They were unattainable goals that nobody could make heads or tails of. And when we looked at all the writing on the wall, it was pretty bad. And so it got worse and worse through the beginning of this year in 2025. And then in April, we all got our phone calls and were told, thank you for working here. We no longer need you. So I was ready for it in some regards, but it's still a bit of a shock when it actually happens. I would say that has had a rather big impact on our lives, as well as the fact that Patty and I have grown up rather poor. We have tried to make saving a priority. And so with my salary, I've always taken advantage of my 401k. When I had an opportunity to switch it to a Roth 401k, I did that. When the kids were born, I bumped my percentage up rather aggressively. And we've always lived on less than we made, even though we rarely had a budget, which is probably one of the things looking backwards we could have done better. But the other things that come along with having an axe hanging over your head is I never used up my vacation. I always kept it so that when the inevitable phone call came, I could get paid out. So I would use it piecemeal and then let it rebuild back up. We tried to pay off our bills and actually did a pretty good job of aggressively doing that up until 2020, I think, when we bought this place here, which hurts a little bit because we had our house paid off. We've lived in the same home for 23 years, so that's something that you can do when you live in a low-cost area and you don't move around a lot. But we had it paid off, and then we took out another mortgage when we bought this property, which we're paying off, but it's still there, so it's a little bit painful. We aggressively paid off our student loans, of which they were rather substantial. 6 years of grad school for me. We both went to a school called Point Loma University Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego that was private. We had some versions of scholarships, but we both came out of there with a reasonable amount of debt. And we've made some generally good decisions, but we've probably spent a little bit more on cars, like much of the Western world has been snookered into doing, more than we should have. But in general, we've done reasonably well financially with our decision making, and so always kind of thinking that it could be over. And now it is, but it's still a shock. Um, you know, but I think I was about as prepared as I could be. Now, in retrospect, I wish I would have been a little more aggressive. I still would like to have bought this property, but maybe not spent as much along the way, that sort of thing, or tightened the belt a little bit more and saved up a little bit more than that. Um, but that's where we are. I can say that we're in a better spot than a lot of people that got laid off with me. And kind of the summation on that is I think we're going to be okay. We're not panicked. And I'm looking at my options at this point. Now it's 4 months down the road, so I've obviously been doing a little bit more than looking, but it's led me to some different thoughts on life and where we're going to go, or at least where we think we're going to go. And so I think I'd call this my learnings or my musings on how we move forward, because I'm in a rather interesting situation. I live in West Virginia, as I mentioned. The economy here is not great. There are some companies around, but generally they've all cut back quite a bit. There's not a whole lot of R&D. There's even less marketing, business development, strategic growth type activities. Most of the chemical industry that I come from has their headquarters or their facilities or their areas where they do that type of stuff in other areas, and what's around us is more the manufacturing arm. So that presents a challenge. What it means is if I want to go out and get another job similar to what I had, I'm probably going to have to move. And for me right now, that puts me in an interesting philosophical position because my kids, as I mentioned, are in high school. I have no desire to take them out of school and move somewhere that honestly at this point I don't want to move to. We're very happy in West Virginia. We like our community, obviously love our farm. The cost of living here from a retirement perspective is very low compared to most of the rest of the country. And as I mentioned, I'm 52. So I've got 4 more years of Ingrid being in high school. Then, obviously she would be expected to go to college. So, somewhere between 4 to 8 years worth of expenses with the kids. And then we're kind of done. So, our plan has been work until we're somewhere around 60. I have a small pension that goes back to GE legacy. That kicks in at 60, and then we could go on our merry way. A little bit ironically, we finally started talking to a competent financial advisor last year. I think it was about October. And as we were talking with him, and it was one of these, hey, come in and it's free and we'll chat. And I had my old GE 401k in another company, and I'd been working with another company that was fairly expensive and not really doing anything because they saw that what I had in my 401k with my existing employer would eventually be of interest to them, but what I had at the moment was not very interesting to them. So they were charging me a lot of money to basically do nothing. So I went into this new financial advisor, just kind of, well, it wouldn't hurt to have somebody else, look at our stuff and see how we're doing, that sort of thing. And we started putting up how we are sitting and what we've got in our accounts and what we owe on our our mortgage and our truck and that sort of thing. And then they started talking about, well, what do you want to do? And this is one of the things when I reflect back on life, I would say it's something that Patty and I should have done a long time ago. You get caught up in life and you don't actually think ahead that officially. And, we always figured we'd retire, but that was way out in the future and we're putting money away. And, when we get there, we'll worry about it. Uh, if I could go back in time and make some suggestions, one of the things I would say is 15 years ago, if not earlier, I should have gone with a competent financial advisor that actually showed some interest in Patty and my future and asked questions about what do we want to do, when do we want to retire, all those sorts of things. And I think this is one of the big challenges for a lot of Americans. Number one, most of us are not financially savvy when it comes to investments and retirement and planning and that sort of thing. If you don't come from a solid base of financial decisions and planning, it's not something you see growing up, and so it's not something you even know what to do. And then you get into this world where they're all looking to take a cut out of what you do have, and your best interests are not necessarily their best interests. And we talked with a few different people. One company that's a big insurance company, we had our when I got sold and I took my GE money out, we put it in there and never heard from them again after they did their initial sales pitch of trying to get us to start buying whole life insurance. And it's one of my regrets, and I wish that I would have found somebody to sit down with and actually do something comprehensively a long time ago, because there's a number of things that we did well, but there's some other things that we did well by kind of luck. And then there's some other things that we could have done better on, in particular, not shoving all of our money into 401k accounts that kind of ties your hands up for quite a while until, traditionally you're 59 and a half. It also would have opened up a discussion on when and how you can potentially retire. Do you have to wait until you're 67 or 62 or 70 or 100 before you can retire? And it's something that being proactive about is a really important thing. And so, when you look at that financial advising industry, it's really important, I think, to get going as soon as you can in your working career and to try to find somebody that at least isn't entirely out for themselves. You're never going to find somebody that's only looking out for you, but there's definitely different levels of self-interest out there. And that's one thing that I think is pretty sage advice. Find somebody that will listen and ask you the questions that are important and help you get a plan to get there. With that being said, we found a good guy, a good group actually. And as we were going through that initial review, we wrapped up and we walked out, and they said they would look at our stuff and put something together, and we'd come back in a month or so and have a follow-up. And I was asked as I walked out the door, any last thoughts? And I kind of jokingly told him, yeah, find a way for me to retire when Ingrid graduates from high school. So I'd be 55, 56, somewhere in that range. And, kind of laughed it off, and he laughed at it, and we left. And I, was joking and never really thought about it. So we went in, I think it was actually in December of 24. And we walked in the door and they asked, how are you doing? I said, oh, we're doing pretty well. And Patty said the same thing. And our advisor looks at us and says, I think you're going to like our discussion today. And I said, oh, really? And he puts up on the screen, and he actually had a way for me to retire when I was 55. And I think it was a joke, but he had Patty working until she was 60, and she didn't like that. So, but I went into that meeting with no expectations. I walked out of there a completely different person. And what I would have to say is it was a discussion that should have happened a long time ago, and it made options available I was never aware of, and it put things on the table that we had never even thought about before. We discussed what we wanted to do. Patty and I, our big aspirations in life are to enjoy our farm here. So, again, why I would have still purchased it and done the work here. I envision being able to do work up here and stay up here for many years. Probably not indefinitely, because I don't know too many 90-year-olds that can fight through 10 feet of snow in the middle of the winter to get up here. But that is one of our big dreams, and it's already here. So that's pretty inexpensive at this point. We also plan on doing a lot of backpacking and hiking, probably starting on the Appalachian Trail. I don't know if it's the year that Ingrid graduates or the next year. We'll have to look at the weather and that sort of thing. And if we're up to it physically, probably try to hit all three of the big trails in the U.S. and maybe a few in other parts of the world. And then in between that, visiting national parks, national forests, that sort of thing. Going to Italy, going to Switzerland, that sort of stuff, and doing a lot of backpacking and hiking. So none of that is free, but it's substantially lower cost than wanting to live it up on the French Riviera or something like that. That's not the kind of people we are. So when our financial advisor looked at what we wanted to do and what we had and how everything was sitting, he said, "Have you ever heard of the rule of 55?" And I said, "No. What are you talking about?" And that raises a whole new set of things that I'll talk about in a minute. And so the gist of this is we walked out of that meeting with the ability to retire when I turned 55. And then my company collapsed on me, and that kind of all got pulled out from under me. And I kind of felt like I'd climbed the highest mountain and then I was in the lowest valley. It was so close, and then it disappeared, because that rule of 55 means that you have to retire from the company in which your 401k resides. And I'll mention that a little bit in a minute here, but getting laid off means at 52 means that was no longer an option. So we went back to our financial advisor actually the day after I was laid off, and I'm thinking, the sky is falling. I'm going to have to move somewhere. I don't want to move. I'm going to have to pull the kids out, or even worse, I'm going to leave the kids here and Patty, and I'm going to have to move somewhere else in the country, get an apartment, and occasionally fly home and see the kids, once a month or something like that, while I lived remote. Because what I have found is that the remote working opportunities have, to a large extent, dried up. Many companies no longer support that. Most of the claims of having remote work out there are not accurate, and what they do want is probably 3-4 days in the office at best. There's a handful out there, but that's mostly what I've been seeing. And so I didn't want to do that. And so we walked back in and just wanted to have a discussion, how bad are we, and how badly do I have to run out and get another job? And sitting with our advisor, he looked at me and goes, "Calm down, it's going to be okay." He goes, "Have you ever heard the rule of 72T? I said, "What are you talking about? Where are all these rules?" And it turns out that those two rules are ways that you can access your 401k accounts before you're 59 and a half. And they each have some different stipulations, but the long story short is a rule of 72T, if you have enough money in your account, allows you to access that money at any age. You can pull out a prescribed amount based on a federal formula. You do not pay a 10% penalty. It comes out and is taxed as if it was normal income. And you set that amount of money that you will get annually, and you are locked into getting that amount of money out of your account every year, the exact same amount from whenever you start taking it until you're 59 and a half or 5 years, whichever is longer. So if you have enough money to cover it, it's a way that you can access your 401k account. So after going through a number of things with our advisor, what we've come to the decision of, or a conclusion of, is that I can go through a complete career change at this point in my life. I can potentially walk away from stress that I didn't even know I had. I knew I had stress, but it was so bad. And the 4 months that I've had since getting laid off, I actually sleep at night. I'm a completely different person at this point. And the thought of having to jump back into a horrible environment, and part of the reason I stayed in that environment was a bit of a trap, because I was able to steer my career and not have to move, and because they had a pension that lasted up until I think about 4 years ago. I kind of felt trapped. I didn't jump ship like a lot of other people because I didn't want to lose those two things. And I put up with an environment that has probably cost me a lot of years of my life just based on stress. And after working with our advisor, I have some options available that Patty and I can both work, much more modest jobs. Well, I mean, she'll stay in her job, but I can completely change careers basically, utilize a 72T rule, and we can make some downward adjustments in the spending in our life, and we can survive. And walking out of that meeting, I thought I was a different person the previous one. When I walked out of that meeting, it's life changing. So the fact that I don't have to panic, I don't have to run out and sell my soul to another company I don't want to work for in a place I don't want to live, is a very, very different spot than what I was in when I went in there. So what it means is I have options. And so what I've started doing is actually substitute teaching. Back in May when I got laid off, first of all, to see if I was even going to be able to do it. Second of all, to see if I would be able to maintain sanity. I have to say that part I still haven't completely come to grips with, because at least with normal subbing, it's incredibly easy and low stress, but it's also very difficult because going from a career where you're putting $1 million programs together and kind of feeling like you're contributing, which I'll get to at the end of this, to basically becoming a glorified babysitter whose only job is to keep the kids from killing each other, is a bit tough. I would like to actually teach. Going back to graduate school where I taught chemistry to graduate students or to undergraduate students, you actually get a rewarding feeling, at least with the small percentage of kids that are in there to learn. You're always going to have the majority that are there because they have to be, but that's a lot easier psychologically to do than to just babysit. But I can do that, make a lot less money, but basically take the stress off the table, and we can survive. And knowing that has really changed my life. The other thing it allows me to do is look for alternative jobs that would be a good fit for a number of reasons. And essentially, I can be more picky. And if something comes along that actually looks good and pays me more and gives me, more of an opportunity to do what my skill set has developed into, that seems like that would be a smarter thing to do over the next, 4, 8, 10 years, whatever it comes out to be, than babysitting. But if it doesn't come out, then that's okay too. So the lack of stress, the quality of life for me, my health improvements, you know, after getting laid off, I would say one of the takeaways here is it's remarkable that a horrible event has actually turned out, at least at this point. Maybe I'll make a video in a year that has a completely different slant to it when we're, having to eat cat food to not starve to death. But to think that a horrible event has actually put me in such a better spot is quite ironic. So, in the meantime, I started subbing for May and into June. I think I did 14, 15 days, something like that. I had summers off, so that was the first time since I was going into my senior year in high school, I guess you could say. Been working up at the farm here, getting a barn up and some other things and doing some things around the house. But, having summer vacations actually kind of nice. I've had a couple recruiters reach out to me after I've updated my LinkedIn profile. Both of those positions gave me a rejection notice. I've had a couple other applications I've sent in. I haven't heard anything back. I'm not heartbroken. As I mentioned, I can be picky and I'm not in a panic, but it still hurts, to get rejected from these things. So, it's an interesting situation. In a way, I feel like I'm wasting my life. In a way, and I guess this is one of those takeaways that the dichotomy of feeling a bit of freedom, getting the shackles off, having the stress removed, knowing that after going through our plan, I don't have to run out and get another corporate job. And then you juxtapose that with the feeling that I think a lot of people in our society have been browbeat with, that if you're not out absolutely killing yourself, you're coming up short and you're failing. I still haven't completely come to grips with that. I also, until the entire 72T thing is finalized next year, because we need to wait until 2026 because of taxes and all that sort of stuff. Until all that's in place and until the subbing thing is really getting going, because it's been slow. We're now in week 3, I think, of school. I got my first call yesterday for only a half day. And I'm not even there now. I'm up at the farm, but hopefully I will be able to sub consistently and actually make enough money, and then complement that with subbing allows me the ability to take off in late winter to do maple syrup. So if I can sell maple syrup and I can sub, basically we can survive and bide our time until my pension kicks in and we can actually access our full 401k and then ultimately Social Security, that sort of thing. But it's a difficult pill to swallow, trying to juggle those two conflicting things. Am I wasting my time and my life, or is there more to life than killing yourself for a company that probably doesn't care? And then ultimately, is all this semi-retired stuff, because I guess if I had to be honest, I kind of consider myself semi-retired. Is it going to work? And on paper, it looks like it will, but there's a gap mentally in believing that until it's all actually in place. So, that's kind of where we're at. So, musings, I guess, would be a way to put this. So, forced semi-retirement. It's an interesting spot to be in. You hear people talk about that. I actually got to witness that with my father. His company let him go. I think it was back in the financial crisis time. When I look at the denials I've gotten so far, how much of that, those are both remote roles, by the way. That's all I've been applying for so far. But how much of that is because there were better candidates? How much of that might be ageism? 52, you're old. Do companies want to take their chance with an old guy who's set in their ways and maybe not going to be there long enough to make it worth the investment and all that sort of thing? Um, it starts to creep in your mind. The whole job market has shifted massively in the last years, I guess you could say. The entire thing is being run by AI now, and it's insane, to be honest. All of the companies are using AI to screen resumes, which means if you believe what you read, 90, 95, 98% of everything never makes it through the filter. It's just getting automatically dumped, so nobody even ever puts eyes on it. The people that are getting through are generally also using the same AI tools to completely manipulate their resumes to hit keywords and get flagged, which means you've got candidates that are probably a terrible fit and aren't qualified that play the game well that are getting in, and you've got candidates that are not good or that are good that are just getting screened out. And so how do you play that game, and you know how do you jump back into it, and all that sort of stuff? And it's an interesting world out there. So I look at that, and again, I'm thankful I'm in a different position than a lot of my peers that were let go as well as me. So, when I think about all this stuff, things I would do differently, things that kind of push people in different positions, that sort of thing, retirement. I mentioned earlier, the importance of getting in there early in your career and getting somebody to help. It's invaluable. Saving. There's no substitute for savings. It seems like on social media today, all you see are younger generations crying about how they can't get ahead, and the system is stacked against them. And yet they're doing it on a brand new iPhone and with their Coach bag and their Starbucks and their big screen TV and their brand new car payment and everything else. The way you win this game, and I think this is even more important considering the whole AI mess that's coming out. And I do agree with a lot of the folks that have been talking about this lately, that it looks like our society is facing a calamity where you are going to have massive, massive, massive unemployment. But the key to this is don't get in debt. Save like the Dickens as early as you can so you can get compounding interest. Tighten the belt. Don't get caught up in chasing after what everybody else is getting, and save, save, save. And I think for my kids, I think by the time my grandkids come out, it's probably going to be too late, but I don't think they're going to have a career even as long as I did, based on the imminent AI destruction of the career paths out there. So make as much as you can, save as much as you can, as quick as you can, and get yourself into a spot with no debt. The rule of 55 and 72T, retirement. I mentioned getting help. It's interesting because I had never heard of that. I've now talked to so many people that are in my network. Nobody has ever heard of this. No one. I mean, we're talking 30, 40 people now I've talked to about this, and it never gets brought up. I now have seen a couple things on YouTube, since my algorithm seems to be inundated with retirement things, but there's a couple that have shown up now that talk about it. But you got to think about people's self-interest and how they're getting paid. And we've got an entire multi-billion-dollar industry that has really pulled a fast one on our society. The Vanguards, the Fidelities, the Charles Schwabs, Merrill Lynch's, all these companies, their entire existence is based on convincing the population that they need to work themselves to death, get as much money as they possibly can, dump it into investment accounts that are managed and siphoned off by those companies, and work until you're a very old age so you can make as much money as possible. And they've done a very good job of convincing professionals in this country that you can't even think about retiring unless you have millions and millions and millions of dollars. So don't ever stop working. And you think about, why would they do that? Well, they get paid based off a percentage of what is in everybody's accounts. So the more money that you put into your account, the more they get paid. So are they incentivized to tell their clients that they have options that allows them to stop contributing and start spending their money down earlier and earlier? Actually, no, that completely takes money out of their pocket and is contrary to raising their stock prices and getting their stock options and their bonuses and all that sort of stuff. And when you actually look at it, there's some pretty amazing statistics out there from a retirement perspective. So the Federal Reserve publishes numbers, I believe it's annually, but it's basically what are the median, which means half the people are above and half the people are below. So it's the middle point. The median amount of retirement savings that people at 65 years old have in the United States. And it's a staggering number. You would think, based on what you've been told, it's millions and millions of dollars. It's actually $300,000, which is not that much money. You also can see some other things out there, and it goes obviously down lower as you get younger and younger. But there's some other things out there. They've done some studies, and I can't remember. I'm going to paraphrase a number of retirement things that I've read and watched on YouTube, but they've done some surveys where they've asked retirement people, are they happy? Are they content? Or do they feel like they're making it okay? And it's somewhere north of 80% of all people that are retired say they're doing fine. And you couple that with the fact that half of the people that are retired have $300,000 or less of savings. What does that tell you? It tells you you don't need millions and millions and millions of dollars for most people. The other thing is, how much money does it take to live? Obviously, if you're living in San Francisco or New York City, it's going to take a lot more money. But, as we've kind of been snookered into thinking you need all this money, we've also been, I think, failed to be kind of educated on making better choices. So not only do you need to save, not only do you need to control your spending, but think about how you live your life. The amount of stuff that our consumerism culture pushes you to get that you really don't need. Look at all these people, that the Swedish death cleaning, I think, is what a big movement right now. All these retired people, what do they all say? Get rid of your stuff, downsize. You don't need all this stuff. We basically all buy and spend like it's going out of style for stuff that we really don't need. Cars probably being the worst of the bunch. We've all been taught very well from the automotive industry that having a mortgage, or not a car payment forever, is perfectly fine. Just think of the amount of money that is going out of people's pockets and into banks and the car companies. And it's staggering. So you think about that sort of stuff, and it's crazy. And then probably the more sobering item, and I can't remember what the actual source is. I've seen this reference from a number of people on YouTube. One is a guy named Azul, Azul. He makes videos daily that are actually kind of interesting, but he has talked about some studies that have come out that talk about the health span. So you have lifespan, which is how old will you make it. Um, there's also something that people have been using called health span, and that's how long will you be in good shape so that you can actually enjoy your life. And the number that comes out on this is heartbreaking. And I'm going to be in the ballpark. I don't remember the exact number, but the average health span of a retired person in the United States is somewhere around 68 years old. So you basically get a couple years on average before you have some major medical or health or life changing event that dramatically changes your ability to enjoy life. So whether you get a cancer diagnosis, whether you have a stroke, whether you break something, whatever that is, whether your spouse dies, maybe, there's a number of different factors in there that lead to a diminished quality of life. So when you think about, we've all been told that we have to have millions and millions of dollars. You have to work until you're 60, 62, 65, 67 if you want full Social Security nowadays, 70 if you want the max you can get, and then the average person doesn't even make it past 68 years old in a condition where they can actually spend their money, which goes into another statistic, which I don't have the exact number on, and that is the vast majority of retirees actually end up dying with more money than what they started with. Now, these are people with, retirement accounts. If you go into retirement and you have nothing, obviously that's going to be a problem. But if you go in there with something, even a modest amount, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, most of these people end up, at least in the last 50 years, dying with much, much more money than what they started with. I mean, we're talking millions, $1, $2, $3 million, over what they went into retirement with. So what does that mean? It means you have to be really careful on who you listen to. You need to get help, but you have to be really careful and be your own advocate. Do you have to work until you're dead? Probably not. And I think this kind of all comes down to the big question in our life, aside from, faith and eternity. The big question on this planet is, how much do you need? And there is no magic answer. If you pick wisely and you keep your debt down, you live in an area of the country that is lower cost, the number's probably a lot lower than what you think, but you need to get to that number. And once you figure out what that number is, and you look at what you've got, you need to start doing some math, because every single minute that you work after you've gotten that number means that you are giving away what little life you have left to a company that in all likelihood could care less whether you lived or died. And is it really worth it to die with extra money in the bank? Now, obviously, you may have some legacy desires to be able to leave things to your kids, which I would contend you probably want to do that before you die anyways, so that they can actually use it when they need it. But you don't win any prizes going into a coffin with millions of dollars in your bank account. And it's something most of us have really been taught not to think about, I think, correctly. And trying to figure out what that number is, should really be our number one goal on this planet, in terms of retirement things, and how we get there and get there as soon as you can, because you've only got a limited amount of time before your health starts to fade, and then ultimately before you're gone. And that kind of brings me to the more philosophical point of this, and I've got just a couple things. So 4 months out now, I've had a handful of discussions, I've had some reflections, and I look back at my working life, and 23 years, there were so many times where I was involved in projects and calamities that were the most important thing on the surface of the earth. This is life or death for everybody. If we don't solve this customer problem, if we don't get this account, if we don't develop this material that can do function A, B, or C, the entire world's going to come to an end. And everything is about getting your internal network going and getting your annual review perfect and figuring out what your 5-year plan is within the company and getting publications and getting patents and this, that, and the other, meeting this deadline and that deadline, and pushing stock prices up and everything. I have to look back at it, and the sad truth, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, if they're going to be honest, is it was all kind of a joke. Now, obviously, for me, it put food on the table. It allowed me to pay my bills. It allowed me to save and get into a position where I can now realistically think about getting to a retirement point where Patty and I can go and enjoy life and backpack and travel, enjoy my farm, continue to make maple syrup, that sort of thing. But all those things that were so important, looking back at it, how much of it matters now? To me, nothing. Looking back at it, how much of it matters to my companies that I worked for? Nothing. If I look back at all these multi-million-dollar programs I worked on, the millions of dollars we made for the company, out of all of it, 23 years worth of a career, and I think I probably ended up with somewhere around, 10 patents, 10, 12 patents, something like that, a bunch of internal publications, tremendous amounts of products that were commercialized, customer problem solved, that sort of thing. If I look back at all of that career and think about how many things have survived to this day, there's probably, I may be generous and say there's probably 3 that are still around. Everything else has been completely thrown away for one reason or another. Either the world moved on and it became obsolete, the business changed directions, they closed assets, they killed product lines because they weren't fitting in with their cost model, or whatever excuse there is. All of it is gone. I look at my coworkers, some of these guys had to be dragged out when they were 40, 44, 46-year employees, forced to retire. Most of them ended up either dying themselves, or a close loved one died, or they ended up getting very sick. The amount of folks that I've lost that I worked with is just astonishing. But I look at some of these just rock stars in my industry that just did so much and so many developments. I mean, they created the basic materials that everybody takes for granted today. Nobody even remembers their name, except a handful of us that had the privilege to work with them. So how much of this really matters? I'm not winning a Nobel Prize. I got things done. I had personal feelings of reward, accomplishing things, but in the grand scheme of things, none of it matters. And that makes me sad, because I said, as Patty and I go into retirement, we're going to enjoy things. One of the things that I would say that I'm very proud of, the fact that we have, as much stress as I had and everything else in the job, I think we've done a reasonably good job, better than most, of enjoying the journey. We've traveled a lot. We've put a lot of focus on experience with our kids as opposed to buying them presents, that sort of thing. Now bug flying here. We still have spent too much money on stuff that mostly ends up in the trash, but being able to take the kids backpacking in the Sawtooth Mountains and the Wind River Range and going up to Cirque of the Towers in Wyoming and Zion National Park and all these just amazing things that we've been able to do. Patty and I have gone to Europe a number of times, enabled by my job, where we've been able to couple vacation onto business trips, and I'm very thankful for that. But the things I'm going to remember, and the things that you often hear old people talking about, I guess I should call myself old now at this point, but it's those experiences, not the PowerPoints, not the gates that you go through with a project, not being able to launch a commercial product, that sort of thing. And I think we've really done a better job than most on enjoying the journey, and now I look forward to being able to enjoy it even more. And that kind of brings me to my second to last point, and then I'll try to wrap this up because it's been too long. The enjoyment of the journey and not putting all of your self-worth in work. If you hear any of the people talk about retirement, they say one of the big problems that people suffer going into retirement is purpose. And that is largely because there are so many people that their entire self-worth is tied up in who they are at their job, what their title has been, the types of projects they're working on, the level of importance that they carry with people looking to them for help or advice, that sort of thing. And the day that you retire, that essentially evaporates. And suddenly being hit in the face with the fact that your job is going to be posted before your obituary prints in the paper, if you died on the job, and the fact that when you do walk out the door, no one's going to care, and they're going to have your spot replaced, before you hit the parking lot. It's a big hit for a lot of people. And if you haven't done a good job of broadening your life beyond work, when you get out of work and you have nothing to do and your life is empty, that's a tragedy. And I look at a number of my colleagues that have been laid off, that have retired, and a handful of them are kind of like me, where they have probably too many hobbies. I look at my life. I have woodworking, and I built this cabin, and I do maple syrup, and we go backpacking, and I mean it's just a never-ending list. I have more things that I could do than I have time left in my life. The key is I need to be able to afford it, and that's obviously the thing that we're looking at this point. But I have a handful of people that I've worked with over the years that are in a similar spot, and generally, when you look at the folks that have retired in that position, they are happy. I look at other people, and there's a lot of them that their entire identity was work, and they have really, really struggled. I recently talked with one of my coworkers who has gone out and gotten another job, is in a very interesting position. He has turned 60, so his pensions are actually available now. They only had one child, have saved very well, financially are way better off than what Patty and I are at, are also in a low-cost area. Essentially they have more money than they will ever spend. Both of their health spans have shortened dramatically, unfortunately, but they have nothing else in life. And another coworker that we shared is in the same spot. And the statement made to me from this friend of mine was that I'm lucky because I have things that Patty and I want to do. And these two guys that I've worked with, they don't have anything. And so all they have is work. And I think about that, and it almost makes me want to cry. To think that you've lived 6 decades on this planet and you get to what we've been told is the finish line. You've made it, and you really have nothing else to do. And even if you do find something else to do, because your health has already started to fail, how much are you going to even be able to do anyways? It's really tragic. And so I think the takeaway there is, you know, as human beings, we really need to think about that balance in life and make sure that work is not everything. And I mentioned earlier my personal thoughts on the likely doom and gloom scenario coming with AI, and the fact that so many people are going to be unemployed. You know, if you put your value in work, and I'm not saying don't put any value, because obviously you need to do a good job. You need to be passionate at what you're doing, but it needs to be balanced out, because when all this stuff ends, what does life really matter if you don't have something that is worth doing? And work is not going to last forever. So it's just something to think about. And then the last point is health. And I just kind of alluded to it with, you work for, in many cases, a company that doesn't care about you whatsoever. In the case of GE, I was told by 3 or 4 different managers specifically that everybody is replaceable. How do you like working for a company that tells you that and lives it? Everybody was replaceable, and they treated everybody accordingly. And the Saudi Arabian company kind of carried on that legacy. So you work for a soulless corporation that really doesn't care. You make a few friends. You're going to keep a few of them. Most of the people you work with, you'll probably never talk to again once you leave that company. And you give up so much of your life, and you do that in exchange for time, which is your most valuable resource. And secondly, the second most valuable thing is your health. And so many of us get caught up in working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, sitting nowadays in front of a computer. And this is my personal problem, that the chair time between sitting in front of a computer and on teleconferences and in airplanes and car seats, that sort of thing, has absolutely destroyed my back. And I've gotten to a point where even a month ago, I was really questioning whether I would have a retirement future, whether I could do any backpacking and camping, that sort of thing, because I was in such bad shape. Luckily, my chiropractor, who's been helping me out over the years, suggested that I get an inversion table, and this will be my infomercial, I guess. If you're having, well, even if you aren't having back problems, but certainly if you are having lower back problems, in my case, sacrum issues, get an inversion table. They're dirt cheap. You go at it at a 45-degree angle, just like 5, 6, 7 times a night. I do it twice a day. The whole thing takes less than 5 minutes a time. It has had a profound impact on the nerve pain I've been suffering in my lower back. But you look at what we've given up to these office type jobs, and a lot of us are really giving up a lot of our health, whether it's joint and muscle pains, whether it's living a life where you don't get proper exercise, where you eat terribly, and you end up morbidly obese. Obviously that has been a calamity in the United States, where I think it's upwards of 40% now are morbidly obese. But you're doing things that you're selling out your future health span. And you can't get it back. The longer you wait, the harder it is to try to fight some of it back. And the reality is you're never going to get it all back. So, prioritize your time, prioritize your health, save early, get some help financially, and really think about priorities in life and plan so that you can put those in the right position. We've talked about this now very openly with our children. That is one thing I think we could have done better earlier, but it's never too late to start. And I hope to be able to influence them uh, to do better than we've done. And hopefully, putting this rambling hour plus video together, if I decide to actually put it up on YouTube, will help some people uh, and give some people some things to think about. Um, if this actually resonates with anybody, I might think about making these maybe quarterly or something like that with an update on how are we actually doing. Because as I mentioned earlier, we now kind of have a plan, but the best plans generally don't survive once the first shots are fired. So, if I am thriving next year, or if we are eating cat food to stay alive, that might be something of interest as we kind of claw our way through the latter years of our working time and start to approach real retirement, not my kind of semi-retirement. So hopefully that was time well spent. And if not, you can hopefully have enjoyed the view. If you look, I don't know today. Yeah, you can see it. The third mountain range over, if it's clear on TV, I believe that's Virginia. So we are, kind of in line of sight, about 2.5, 3 hours away from Washington, D.C., because having going down all the mountain roads and stuff. But leaves are starting to change. Mentally, I'm in such a better spot, and I can actually, I mentioned sleeping, but I also can sit here now and actually enjoy living in the moment. And when Sundays roll around, I don't have to get anxiety because of the nightmare I have to go back into and start answering to people with unrealistic expectations, and who knows what kind of wind change is going to happen this week versus next week versus next week. So it's a different life. Hopefully, what we think our future looks like is somewhat accurate. And let me know if you guys want to hear any updates, and I will provide. And as I mentioned, I am in between putting roofing rafters up. So if you are interested in looking at one guy struggle to put up a timber frame barn, you can probably get some of those videos in and around this stuff. Kind of like my career and my life, things are all over the place. So financial kind of retirement videos, layoff videos, interspersed between making maple syrup and using my sawmill and putting up a 100+ year old barn. So again, hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day, and I'm going to sign off.